Hi, everyone, and welcome to our final panel today, Advocacy Roadmaps to Coverage Lessons from Other Conditions. I'm Vanessa Weisbrod, the Chief Programs Officer at the Celiac Disease Foundation, and I'm so excited to get to moderate this panel. So, throughout today, we've discussed diagnosis, treatment eligibility, clinical evidence, and payer coverage. But many disease communities have learned that FDA approval is not the finish line. It's often the beginning of a new set of challenges. In this session, we'll hear from leaders who have helped navigate the path from therapeutic innovation to real-world patient access. Our goal is to identify lessons that the celiac disease community can apply now before therapies arrive. Our first speaker is Aaron Turner Pfeiffer from Breakthrough T1D. Aaron serves as the Senior Director of Health Policy at Breakthrough T1D, where he leads strategic efforts to shape the future of healthcare access and innovation. With over 15 years of experience advising and crafting public policy at the federal, state, and local levels, Aaron is a seasoned expert in navigating the complexities of the American healthcare system. Throughout his career, Aaron has specialized in healthcare quality initiatives and the development of policies impacting prescription drug benefits, commercial insurance markets, and government programs, including Medicare, Medicaid, and the health insurance marketplace. Welcome, Aaron. We're excited for your talk.
Thank you, Vanessa. Super excited to be here. We were just saying our office actually closes early for summertime, so I'm off books after hours here. Super excited to be with everyone. And just a personal note, my wife about 10 or 11 months ago was diagnosed with celiac, so it's also personal cause for me now. And I know I remember back, sitting with my wife's physician. And one of the first things she said to us was, are you guys aware of the Celiac Foundation?" and pointed us in you all's direction. So, for me and for my wife and our family, thank you for everything you've been doing, everything you're planning to do. So impactful, and again, just super excited to be here with you all today. So I want to talk about Breakthrough. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about is some of the successes that Breakthrough T1D, formerly JDRF, has had. And I've been with Breakthrough about 6 years in my current role. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is me standing on the shoulders of others and so much work that has gone in. And this is just a snapshot here from one of our recent events here in DC. This is most of our advocacy team. We got a couple of folks missing, but just a picture here of our advocacy folks. And so I want to start with our mission. We were founded about 50 years ago or over 50 years ago by parents with kids who had type 1 diabetes. And our North Star has always been to find a cure for type 1. And as you can see here, our mission is to accelerate life-changing breakthroughs to cure, prevent, and better treat type 1 diabetes and its complications. So as we are striving for a cure, we are also working to make day-to-day life easier and better for folks living with type 1. So I know a lot of folks are going to know some about type 1, but let me just provide some context here. About 1.6 million people are living with type 1. We know that if we forecast this out or use different data sets, I've seen CDC project around 1.8. We've seen other data sets around 2 million, but this is around the range we're talking about with folks living with type 1. Um, you know, we changed our name in part because JDRF, the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, didn't really reflect the lived experience and what was really happening with folks living with type 1, both in the United States and around the world. About half of people diagnosed today with type 1 are actually adults. And given some of the scientific innovations, care developments, our successes around access, both here in the US and globally, there are more adults living today with type 1 than ever before, certainly more adults living with type 1 than kids. So Breakthrough T1D, we really are trying to focus on that entire care continuum, but it's more common for kids to be diagnosed. One of the more common chronic conditions in terms of prevalence for kids under the age of 18. One of the important things in our work recently has been highlighting for policymakers exactly how many people are living with type 1 and enrolled in Medicare. Again, people still think of type 1 as a condition mostly impacting kids, but over 600,000 folks are on Medicare today living with type 1, more, I think, than ever before. We do expect these numbers to continue to grow as folks are getting better access to technology and care. They're healthier, they're living longer. A 30+% growth over the next decade. But despite all these developments and successes, folks today are still living 11 years shorter life time expectancy than folks without type 1. And so we got a long way to go. So a lot of progress made. We're tackling some of those stigmas and still to this day. But I think tremendous progress being made, not just here in the US, but globally as well. I also just want to highlight, the breakout for folks with type 1, about 5 to 10% of folks who are diagnosed with diabetes have type 1. That other 90% is, by and large, type 2. And then there's often a connection with celiac. I think about 10% of folks with type 1 often have a co-diagnosis at some stage with celiac. And so back to breakthrough here and how we kind of organize our work across our organization. We often talk about a pipeline. And so our organization really started as an organization funding research. And so a lot of discovery research evolved into translational research. As we made progress on the science, we had more and more technologies and care and drugs going to the FDA and EMA and other places for regulatory approval. So we really have expanded organizationally as we've made progress around science. And then, once we were successful with regulatory approvals, realized the importance of insurance coverage, the dynamics around access, and have most recently, we're now about 3 years into having developed a medical affairs team to really hone in and focus on the clinical adoption pieces. And we think of ourselves as educators and accelerators. So educating folks across this pipeline about the importance of advancements in type 1, what the lived and day-to-day experience is with folks living with type 1, and then accelerators. We are accelerators where there are gaps. There are drugs on market today where if breakthrough T1D at the time, JDRF, wasn't funding the research, wasn't pushing companies to continue to invest in this space, wouldn't be on market today. And so we're proud of those, but those are places where we consider it important for us as a voice of the patient community to really kind of carry the baton and make sure that gaps are being filled, or we're at least identifying gaps so that other stakeholders and partners can fill those. So specifically our advocacy team, we talk about this in 5 pillars, but you can also talk about this in kind of a linear timeline, right? We started as our founding network or parents with type 1. We started with grassroots, and as we engaged and made progress on the science, I think we realized the importance of getting policymakers here based in DC involved, and have had folks engaged in our government relations work for over 20 years. And that's resulted in funding for the Special Diabetes Program, which is a congressionally funded research program that has done tremendous work investing resources into type 1 diabetes. And from our government relations work, we realized that we needed to raise the profile and understanding of living with type 1 and the importance of scientific advancements in type 1 with our regulators at FDA and eventually EMA and other regulatory bodies. And our regulatory affairs team was created and has grown. And the health policy team, which I'm a part of, was a result of realizing the insurance coverage. Just because we had a good FDA label on many of our devices and therapies we cared about, didn't result in affordable access to these innovative technologies. And so our health policy team is labeled health policy. It's a mix of health policy work and market access work. And that came after our regulatory affairs team as we were moving down the pipeline. And then most recently, our global responsibility team, as we've had success in the US and other countries expanding access to these innovative technologies. What we've realized is that others with type 1 living in low and middle income countries are not getting access to these innovative technologies. In fact, upon kind of review and going out and talking to folks, realized that a lot of these folks were not getting access to kind of basic standard of care for those that are living with type 1. So our global responsibility team has been focused on elevating care in different low and middle income countries with other stakeholders and global partners. So as Vanessa said, let me give an example of a success in progress. There's been tremendous work in this space. Work certainly continues, but around continuous glucose monitors, CGMs. For those that don't know, this is exactly what it sounds like. It's a device that allows you to monitor your glucose, your sugar levels, and near real time. Before these devices existed, we had finger sticks and blood glucose monitors, and that was kind of the standard of care. You did this when you could. Um, you hoped to make kind of insulin dosing adjustments around this, but it didn't really give you trend information, real-time information to allow you to have interventions yourself. And folks with diabetes are largely doing these decisions and dosing on their own with little kind of clinical guidance in real time. And so these CGMs really held the potential to kind of revolutionize not just clinical care, but the daily burden of living with type 1. And so the potential value and impact to the community was clear and obvious. But what we see is that it was a long, long road, much too long a road, in our reflection, to get broad insurance coverage. And so you see here the first CGM approved in 1999. It was really 10 years before we consider the first commercial health plan to really meaningfully begin to cover in their formal coverage policies, CGMs. Another 8 years for Medicare to offer initial coverage. And then we see a kind of a cascade here. In 2019, most major commercial insurers are covering CGMs, and then we see ultimately CMS here expanding access to all CGMs available via some of their coverage policies. In this intervening time, certainly the first CGM approved in 1999 was not nearly as sophisticated as the ones in 2009, and certainly not in 2019. So there's iterative technology advancements here, but this was a lot of work from the community to explain the impact of these devices. The community was met with, at the time, you have blood glucose meters, you have finger sticks, we cover those. You've got insulin and better working insulin. Isn't that enough? What's the value of these? Why would we pay more than a relatively cheap blood glucose monitor? What's the real impact for us? Where's the cost savings? So there's a lot of work being done, both by industry, but also by people living with type 1 to explain what it means to have real-time information on your blood sugar levels or to have real-time information for your child in the middle of the night. And instead of having to wake them up at 2 or 3 in the morning or set an alarm at 2 or 3 in the morning to make sure you didn't have a severe hypo event in the middle of the night, what that meant in terms of just daily living. There's a lot of work being done with insurers, with policymakers at CMS and HHS to help them understand what was happening in terms of the daily life of folks with type 1. And here in the bottom right corner, you can see today some of our estimates. Just around 60% of folks on Medicare are using a CGM, and only about 22% though are using a CGM that talks to their insulin pump. And so this decreases the amount of work the person has to interpret, and really does provide kind of better real-time glucose management. And so we've got a lot of work yet to be done around clinical adoption. But certainly things are moving in this direction of more folks using technology and having better outcomes. And I should say, during this time, the clinical benefits were clear. They just weren't clear in a data set that made sense to payers, right? We knew in some of the clinical trials, outcomes were real. We knew qualitatively it improved life. But the data, it took us a while to get to the point of developing data that clearly matched payers' expectations. An example is of Medicare. Medicare wanted data in real time of the impact of these devices on a senior population exclusively. And so while clinically we didn't believe there was any meaningful kind of difference in impact from a 64-year-old to a 65-year-old, it was still a requirement that Medicare wanted to see, and that's data that Breakthrough JDRF at the time went and got and developed. And so we haven't stopped. We haven't stopped proving the value of these devices. to policymakers and to payers. This is just a snapshot of a chart that we published last year when we were going to Capitol Hill to say thank you for the special diabetes program funding. Without it, we wouldn't have the CGMs we have today. And one of the things I've learned, I'm not a scientist by training. One of the things I've learned from our researchers is that science begets science, and so these amazing impacts that these devices have had for type 1 turns out that they work pretty well for type 2, and the rollover and spillover effects of the impact of savings from better health outcomes across the diabetes community have been tremendous. And so this is always a great thing to take to folks to say thank you and to show not just to tell them about the lived experience and the improvements in life from this technology and these investments, but really to show also cost savings as well. Oh, I went too far. Sorry. As I wrap here, let me just highlight some lessons learned. Start early. That's something that we have certainly learned. Never assume that folks understand the importance of an innovative care or device or technology. We've been most effective as a convener and the voice of the community, and so not pushing a preferred solution, but really trying to help health plans and policymakers make informed decisions and make sure that they understand what's important to the community. Um, Data for data's sake is not always the most energizing way to engage folks in the space. So we bring data to tell stories. How does what we're seeing in the data match to the lived experience? And then helping folks understand why it matters to the community. And then someone on our team recently said once about the key to our success at Breakthrough, and she described it as being persistent but not annoying. Showing up, answering questions, conveying challenges, conveying successes, and continuing to show up an event after event and day after day, but not being annoying. It's a tight rope to walk, and when you hear no, not being disgruntled by that, but staying persistent, and Breakthrough has kind of followed this path throughout our history to invite others to join us to cure this condition, and has been a tremendous success. I should say these are lessons learned the hard way. These same lessons are being applied to an effort we recently launched called Project ACT, Accelerating Cell Therapies. There are cell therapies underway. We hope that will be available soon that could potentially cure type 1 diabetes or a version of cure. And so we are working to accelerate that using these lessons learned because we're running into the same challenges. Why pay for a cell therapy when there are CGMs and insulin pumps and cheap insulin available? What's the value of a cell therapy? And we're bringing these stories to bear today and these lessons that we've learned to bear today. So with that, I will wrap. I promised that I wouldn't go long, and I went long anyway. So the dangers of a Friday.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I think that being persistent but not
Thank
annoying
you.
is a takeaway message we should all keep from today and not forget. So our next speaker is Michelle Rice. With more than 30 years of experience in healthcare policy and advocacy, Michelle is a nationally recognized leader known for advancing collaborative, solutions-driven approaches that strengthen patient care and promote healthcare sustainability. As CEO and founder of Michelle Rice and Associates, she brings deep expertise to building consensus among diverse stakeholders, including legislators, state regulators, clinicians, payers, patients, and the pharmaceutical industry. Through her work, Michelle continues to champion policies and initiatives that improve healthcare access, quality, and affordability, creating lasting impact for patients and the broader healthcare system. Welcome, Michelle. We're excited for your talk.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm trying to make sure I get my slide. Can you see my slides?
They are coming, not quite yet. Okay, there you
Okay.
go. They look great.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Michelle Rice. As you heard in my bio, I've spent the last 34 years working in the bleeding disorders space. In full transparency, I have mild hemophilia. Both of my boys have severe hemophilia. And I got interested in really engaging on access to care at the payer level very early on because my son met his maximum out of pocket or his lifetime limit at 4 years old. And so we definitely learned very quickly that things were a little bit more difficult than they would have seemed to us. I am not being able to get it to advance, so I'm not sure.
Is there a little arrow at the bottom left of your screen?
I'm not. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry.
There-
Um, Again, I started by working at a local hemophilia chapter in the state of Indiana, and that's where I first got involved with legislative advocacy. And then I transitioned to right before healthcare reform began. I transitioned to work at the national office. And then in 2021, at the end of 2021, I left the National Hemophilia Foundation and opened my own consulting business because I really believe that the only way we are all going to be able to get the care we need is if we are working together. Because if just one of us is going in trying to solve just one problem, it just kind of kicks the can down the road. So just to give a little bit of background, there's about 33,000 people with hemophilia in the United States. So we are small, but we are probably the most expensive condition to treat. On average, I would say someone with severe hemophilia is anywhere from $450,000 a year up to $600,000 a year. For those who have complications, it can be well over $1 million a year. And that is just for their medication, not if they go to the doctor. So obviously, we were a big target on health plans, radar screens. And in fact, right before health reform started to come out, most of our patients were receiving care through, they might have been on their parents' employer plan. They might have been on Medicaid. In Indiana, they were on the high-risk pool. And so we really did have fairly decent access to care. We didn't have many products at the time. We had about 6. Our patient population had been impacted heavily by HIV. We lost 10,000 people due to, the plasma that was in the products we were using. And so really health plans did not try to manage us. Again, we were a small group and pretty much had very limited choice. So we had access to kind of whatever we needed. But we knew with health reform coming out and in preparation for what was going to occur, we knew that we were going to probably become managed because there was going to be much more use of managed care programs. And so we decided we needed to make sure we started to educate payers about hemophilia, the current landscape, kind of what we saw in the pipeline, why we felt that there needed to be these additional products coming out. And we really wanted to make sure that we stress the importance of being at the right site of care. So we actually in 2010 decided to start on an education pathway to educate payers, like as I said, in anticipation of health reform. And our vision was we want to make sure that we enable every person with hemophilia and other benign bleeding disorders to receive the right care at the right time, in the right setting, and at the right cost. We recognized we were very expensive. And our strategic goal was to kind of bridge communication, between our clinicians and payers, increase each other's knowledge of what the other party needed, and to bridge the trust gaps among stakeholders. We found because we were very expensive, there was always a little bit of resistance between our physicians communicating with the payers and vice versa. And so typically who the payers would hear from would be patients at a point where they were stressed and struggling because they didn't have access to something that they needed. So we wanted to make sure we brought together those stakeholders who were responsible for care delivery, utilization, cost management, and we wanted to bring in the patients as well. So again, we decided to hopefully minimize our obstacles through education. We wanted to build shared understanding, and the idea was that we wanted to make sure that patients and payers and clinicians came together to really talk about what they each needed, what were their pain points, how could we make sure that everybody was getting a little bit of what they wanted, but making sure that patients were getting what they needed. And what we found was that, again, we wanted to find some way to build consensus between those groups, because misaligned priorities were often the reason that unnecessary barriers were created. So the challenge was, the environment that we were in, right? There was making sure that people understood kind of what disease management looked like for patients with hemophilia, kind of, again, what were the current standards of care, what were the unmet needs, and really what were optimal outcomes, or what does good look like. We wanted to make sure that that all parties started to understand the drivers of cost and the complexity that came with that. What were the factors that influenced care and cost? A lot of times we think of the clinical factors, but we weren't necessarily always thinking about the system factors or the treatment factors. And the fact that not all of these drugs, they were biologics, not all of these drugs impacted every patient in the same way. So our kind of message was, high cost doesn't always equal high value, and low cost doesn't always result in optimal outcomes. How do we find a median? And what we did was we started out by producing a series of webinars, and the faculty involved included a clinician, a nurse, and a payer executive, whether that be a medical director or a pharmacy director, and that would serve as faculty on these webinars. The first year we had about 150 people register, and we were really targeting payer executives so that we could really kind of start to build that bridge. We wanted to, through our education, promote transparency and shared goals. We wanted to make it clear that we hope to create open and honest dialogue, and that we would expect for everyone involved to respect all perspectives, whether that's from the payer's point of view, the provider's point of view, or the patient. And we wanted to talk a little bit about moving beyond one size fits all cost management strategies. And I'm sure that many of us have experienced this. There's things like step therapy, there's things like fail first. And in our disease state, what we saw was that implementing those types of strategies, cost management strategies, often could lead to increased cost rather than lowering cost, and result in poor outcomes. So, our point was uniform policies can often have unintended consequences, and maybe patient-centered management would be a better approach. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but I was able to utilize our own personal experience to really kind of drive home the message that not everybody responds the same. I have 2 children, both with severe hemophilia, both with the same genetic, disruption, yet they were never able to use the same product. It just didn't work right for them. We didn't really know why, but we could show the tests. I would put up on the screen, here's what, the tests show. And for my child, in order to get, for my kids, in order to get the same result, the same factor level, which was going to prevent their bleeding, they might have to use 3 times as much of one product as the other. Versus if they just used a different product, it could lead to lower cost. So it seemed to really make an impact with legislators and with payers when we could show them, here's some, hard data out of one family. And, we wanted to make sure that we were going to create a shared objective, which was to improve outcomes while responsibly managing resources. Again, we always went in saying, we recognize that we are expensive and we want to find ways to control cost. But we want to tell you how sometimes your policies may be actually increasing that cost. And we'll recognize that sometimes it's our behavior that is increasing costs. And our goal was to start aligning utilization management with clinical realities. So the way we decided to do this was, how do we design a forum for meaningful engagement? As I said, we started off with doing webinars. We did those for about 4 years. By the time we were done, the last 2 years, we were doing 3 different tracks. And we would find that people that would come would sign up for all 3. They wouldn't wait until the second one was ready. They would just go in and sign up for all 3. By the time we concluded the webinar series, we had over 1,300 different payers that were participating. And we had government agencies that were participating in the program. We had prison systems. We had, and when I say government programs, it was federal and state programs. And we found that they started to reach out more to at least the clinicians who were on the webinars. We started to have to then educate them about, our whole network that we had that they could reach out to. And so what we decided to do was to create a multi-stakeholder collaborative comprised of key opinion leaders, all that brought some diverse expertise to the table. And the objectives were to bridge communication gaps, improve understanding of stakeholders' perspectives, share best practices, identify barriers to care, and try to develop some practical solutions. We wanted there to be equal representation, open dialogue, data-driven discussions. We wanted to focus on patient outcomes, and we wanted to develop some consensus-based recommendations. And the way we did that, again, we brought together a group of payers and we made sure they were diverse. Was it someone who was working in Medicare? Was it someone who was working in the Medicaid space? Was it somebody who was private insurance? We brought in representatives from self-insured employer groups. And then we brought in clinicians. We brought in clinicians that were part of a larger institution, whether it be a university, whether it be a children's hospital. We brought in independent organizations. We brought in, representatives from treatment centers that were in very rural settings. And then we brought in folks from the patient advocacy organizations. I apologize. I wish I could get my dog to stop, but he's not going to. And what we did in that first meeting was we spent the first whole meeting, which was a 2-day meeting, really getting to know each other and understand each other's cost drivers, understand our goals and objectives. So for example, the first day we had presentations by all of the payers saying, here's what keeps us up at night when we look at this disease state. Here is what our concerns are when we're looking at costs. Here's what we don't understand. Why is it that, one patient is receiving, this amount of medication, another patient that has the exact same condition, the exact same severity level is receiving either less or more? Why is that happening? And why is it that, some people are using prophylactic treatment, other people are using on-demand treatment? We want to understand how those decisions are being made. Then what we had was the next day we took the payers to one of the largest treatment centers in the country, and we allowed them to go in and meet with the different members of the team, of the comprehensive care team, to say, what is it that you do? Why is it that how often does a patient come in to see you? How do you bill for your services? So it was really just kind of getting to understand each other a little bit better. And then our goal was for the follow-up meeting was to say, all right, how do you determine what good is? As a payer, how do you determine what is good? As a clinician, how do you determine what is good? And as a patient, how do you feel how do you determine what is the best care for you? And then what we said was, let's go back and pull some of this information from our different databases. Let's come back and share that and see where are we the same and where are we different. And, as we heard in the previous presentation, data for data's sake is not always a good thing. We actually had some of the clinicians who were quite surprised to hear the payers say, you've given us too much data. Now it's confusing. What we really need is this. We really don't need this. We understand why you collect it. We understand why it's good for you. We understand why it may be good for your federal partners, but it's not really good for us. It actually just confuses the issue. And so we started to talk through that. And then what we did was we came back and we said, let's narrow down to 3 to 5 metrics that we think define good. And how can we best share those metrics? And then what we did was we wrote a white paper and we published it, and we went to a meeting of the to several of the payer meetings, and we set up booths and we said, come look at this. This gets you information about us. Would you like to get involved in this conversation? When we started, we had 5 payers, I believe. I think now that group is up to, they have 15 to 20 payers that participate. And we have done multiple papers since then. We have created many documents together. We have we had several payers who would reach out to us now and say, okay, we're going to change our utilization management guidelines for this disease, but we want to better understand if what we're putting in here really gets us the information we need, or is it really just something that makes it harder for the patient and the clinician? And so we found much more open dialogue happening between our clinicians and our payers. And we actually also found the payers reaching out more often to us as a patient advocacy organization to request our help as being a convener for these conversations. So what I want to really focus on here is that we found that coming together, having open and honest dialogue, allowed us to build stronger partnerships together, allowed us to create, to reach better decisions, not only from the payer's perspective, but from the clinician's perspective. They didn't really understand the utilization management guidelines because they'd never had those. This was not a disease that was managed. And so they're like, why do we need to start justifying all of this? We don't understand. This is just, increased administrative burden. So just wanted to say that collaborative started in 2014. It is still going today at the National Hemophilia Foundation, which is now the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation. We also entered into a partnership with the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy. I can tell you from a patient perspective and an advocate's perspective, attending those meetings really helped me better understand what payers were trying to accomplish. And it allowed me to create some suggestions that allowed the payers to get what they wanted, but also still ensured that our patients were getting what they needed. And so I know that that is still going on. I attend that conference every year. I am pleased that I see more and more times where there are payers and patient advocacy organizations on panels together, like we've seen today. And I think that we need to kind of try to see things from each other's perspective, try to understand that none of us are trying to hurt each other. We are all trying to do the same thing. We do want the patients to get better. And so how do we find ways to create those opportunities for us to come together, to have those dialogues? And how do we kind of level set our expectations when we come in? And what I say often, and what I would say as a patient advocacy organization, is none of us, meaning the patient advocacy organization, the payer, or the clinicians, are going to walk out of that room with everything they wanted. Hopefully, we're going to be able to walk out with some of the things that we wanted. But the real measure of success is that when we walk out and the patient is getting everything that they need. And, I think the comment earlier about persistence, what I used to say is there's always time for righteous indignation and for confrontation or difficult conversation, but that shouldn't be where it starts. It should be that we're starting with the sense of how can we improve the lives of these people together, and again, still meet some of our goals and objectives as organizations. And I found this quote that I just really believe in, which is there's immense power when a group of people with similar interests get together to work towards the same goals. So I am going to stop. I'm not sure where I am on time, but I will stop sharing my screen and turn it back to you, Vanessa.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was absolutely incredible. And I just want to thank you so much for all the work that you've done and for so transparently sharing your family's story. It really highlights how important it is for us to keep the patient voice front and center. So thank you.
Mhm.
So now I would like to ask that Dr. Singh join us on the main stage and we will open up the panel. Dr. Singh is a clinical associate professor of medicine in the Division of Gastroenterology and Hepatology at Stanford University. Through the American Gastroenterological Association, he has advocated with private and public payers on behalf of patients and physicians to enable timely access to medications, including policies regarding biosimilars and Medicare Advantage prior authorization policies. Prior to joining the faculty, he completed a postdoc fellowship at Stanford University's Clinical Excellence Research Center. Through this program, he met health system and insurance leaders across the country, developed comprehensive programs to address obesity and colon cancer screening. Welcome, Dr. Singh. We're so glad that you could join us today.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Singh, can you tell us a little bit about coverage strategies for biologics and other GI therapies?
Yeah, so through the American Gastroenterology Association, for our patients with inflammatory bowel disease, that's become the largest cost center for most payers for patients with any sort of gastrointestinal disorder and the highest variance in costs, meaning, where you're receiving your care. And so what we've realized, kind of like my colleagues on the panel have discussed, is when you get the pairs together with our people and we have a discussion, we actually have similar goals, keeping people out of the hospital, preventing complications. And so that has been really helpful in aligning our interests. And similarly, like Michelle was talking about, there are certain incentives that maybe working with the payers from our side, developing pathways on what would be appropriate indications for starting medications, having clear outcomes for, what is determined or deemed to be an appropriate treatment success. How are you going to evaluate that longitudinally over time because one of the common themes that came up with us in our discussions with the payers is that, we'll start a medication. We don't want the patient taking the medication forever if it didn't work. And this sounds bad, but it's surprising and unfortunate how often patients are starting a medication and they stay on it for much longer than would be appropriate. And so those are things that from, our patient advocacy side, professionalism side, those are things we can help with. And we've identified that over the years, one of the biggest obstacles for patients with inflammatory bowel disease receiving care is all these obstacles. And we've written a white paper about this, that the obstacles across the spectrum, again, identifying what the barriers are specifically, and then targeting, partnering with others in order to overcome these. And part of it comes into what's common in medicine today is the prior authorization process, which we've advocated locally, nationally, talking with private and public payers that really that's practicing without a medical license and trying to limit those barriers. But it's also interesting when you get in a room with the payers, often they're asking us for advice on what's reasonable, right? And
Mhm.
the cost of medications have gone so astronomical that they say, listen, to change the dose from every 8 weeks to every 4 weeks is going to cost us $120,000 extra a year. Now, that's very reasonable for someone to ask what is a reasonable ask from a physician or a provider to provide data to guide that decision.
Great, thank you. So earlier this week, I was giving a Grand Rounds presentation, and during our Q&A, someone asked why the celiac community even cared about a drug when we have a diet to treat our disease. And as a celiac patient and mom to a celiac child, I was very floored by this question, but I think that it highlights a really important issue that our disease and the hardships associated are clearly very misunderstood. Michelle, I know that you talked about some of them, but for anyone on the panel, what were the misconceptions about your disease that created challenges with insurance, policymakers, and the public, and what were some ways you tried to overcome them?
One of the biggest ones for us, and I remember this, and you talk about being floored. I was I was a little angry. Was on one of our webinars, and as I mentioned, there is some patients have complications from their hemophilia where their body starts fighting off the factor because the medication because they recognize it as foreign. For those patients, the treatment to kind of cure that is just like to overload the body with the medication. Well, I already said how expensive it is. Some of these patients, it could be two, three, $4 million a year when they're going through this. And I remember being on there and having all these great questions. And then someone said, look, I get it. I get, this is a biologic. I get that, this community had all these issues, all this kind of stuff. But, gosh, we got some of these patients with inhibitors who are like $1 million or more a year. I mean, when is enough enough? And I had to count to 10 and reminded myself that they don't know. I said, what I'm going to tell you, if you ask them, they would have said the second time they had to infuse in the same day because this medication they have to infuse every 3 hours and they have to access a vein every single time. Trust me, they would have said the first time enough was enough. And I said, and I get your frustration, but here's the alternative, right? And then it was like the next series of webinars, the same person was on there. And the person said, okay, so I've been on a couple of these, and I just want to say, I think I finally get this. It really is critical that the patient is seen at one of these treatment centers in order to make sure they're being dosed correctly and on the right drug. And I said, I typed into my boss, I said, oh my goodness, the sky has opened and the angels are singing because it was like just this total turnaround of this one person. And you have to remember, they don't know. They don't know what they don't know. Think about when you were first diagnosed, you know? Um, I had no idea what we were in for. So yeah, it's just I think it's trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes is, kind of one of the things you have to remind yourself to do because you're like, how do you not know that?
Michelle, I would just add, I don't live with type 1. I have a lot of friends and very, very close friends with type 1. But one of the things that we always encourage our advocates when they're coming to the Hill and to talk to members of Congress is like, if you're having a low event, tell them, show them your devices. If you need to change a pump site, if you need to change your devices, show them what it's like. And it's really, it's hard to get over that hump that were talking about, Michelle, but they don't know. And the more they know, the more likely they are to engage in a meaningful way. And it's hard. And we ask our families to go in and talk about, you see someone with type 1. And sometimes you can't, they look fine, not without realizing the mental burden of hundreds of medical decisions they're making around kind of dosing their insulin and managing their care each day. And so sharing that experience, I think, is super impactful and is beneficial just to help people make more informed and less comments like you heard, Vanessa, of just asking why are these things important?
But I
Well,
do think,
the other thing that I thought that we found that was really helpful was we said, look, again, we know we're expensive. Let us show you a way that we believe you could save some significant costs right off the bat. Here's what you would be doing. You don't manage which drug they're on, but you want to manage how they're being dosed and their assay management, because obviously, like, biologics are different. You can't just cut something off like you do with a pill, you know? So how do you know how much to give them? What do you do? And so they were very surprised that we were willing to share that information. We want to keep access to what we have. We know we need to be responsible.
no, and I think it's a different discussion in my experience with private and public payers. I've gone to Congress multiple times, and in those, the stories are very important, I feel like. And that's what's really, it's like story, kind of your ask, followed by you know, what the ideal outcome is. With the private payers, I feel like it's much more of a financial argument that I'm trying to build. And this will sound bad, but often I don't even talk about the clinical outcomes because I know the fiduciary responsibilities that they carry. I'm like, I'm going to try to build a business argument for you why this is going to be helpful for everyone involved. And some of it, depending on who you're talking with, which group, if you want to work locally, major employers are incurring their own costs, right? And so absenteeism from work is plays into this. And so I think who you're talking with does make a difference.
Absolutely. Which message you start with is for each different group. It's very, very important.
The other part comes into what we've actually worked to support my colleagues across the country who take care of patients with inflammatory bowel disease we've realized talking with the payers is the difficulty in dealing with documentation and communicating succinctly what is happening with the patient. Why are you asking for this? And, I even say this, I read my colleagues' notes from time to time. Sometimes it's hard for me to figure out what's exactly going on. And I might be doing a patient's colonoscopy and I have to ask the patient, I think you're doing well, right? Like, I just want to double check because the document's 20 pages long. And so we've created some educational material to help guide offices throughout the country to be like, here's what you need to document. Disease, location, severity, prior therapy. Make it very crystal clear. You don't want the person going on a wild goose chase hunting for this stuff. And that are the key to success for getting approvals. But on the front side, for getting drug approval and being on formulary, we've found that, they're interested in studies. But like you said, Michelle, you don't want to be overloaded with studies because they're not getting a PhD in this. But they're also open to things that are not randomized clinical trials. And so one of the most fascinating conversations I had was about 15 years ago in a different space, but the insurance company said, listen, this drug is FDA approved for condition A. It actually is not very effective for condition A. Let's be honest. But condition B, it's actually off-label, but does really well. And so even FDA approval isn't necessarily your gateway to success and getting approvals. And so having that understanding has been really informative for me and guiding these conversations.
You hit on something that was really meaningful in our community because, like I said, our docs weren't used to having to do prior auth because there was only a handful of drugs and they covered them all, right? And they were a little afraid of getting on it after the HIV crisis and all that. So what would happen is the docs would say, well, I can't get through the prior auth process. And I'm like, well, let me see the denial. Well, I hadn't submitted it. They said, because I didn't know what to submit for the prior auth. They said, I don't want to give them too much information. And I said, well, in reality, they're paying the bills. So as a patient, I'm saying, give it all to them, whatever you think it needs. But I said, but in reality, they don't know enough about the disease. They can't say, we need to know this, and this. And, they don't know that, hey, this patient has bad veins. And so they're wasting product because their vein blows. That's what you need to say. I said, the best thing you could do is attach your clinic notes. And I did when you made that decision and why you made it. You put that there. I said, and like I said, like you did, I gave them a standard letter template that said, here's what they need to know. But just attach your clinic notes to it. And we ended up having about a 98% success rate in overturning denials. And I was like, there was no magic. It was just going back to the clinician and saying, why did you change it? Submit that. That's what you need to do. Tell them exactly why.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and I think a lesson that we're starting to learn through the planning of this whole conference. We've seen, if you were watching our genetics panel this morning, just the great variance in how genetic testing is reported and how it's reported in our clinicians' notes. So I think this is really good advice for our medical community to take back and start really thinking about how we document a diagnosis of celiac disease, and also how we're going to document all these patients who are self-diagnosed celiac when there's a drug and everybody is going to want a drug. So, Erin, you are familiar with celiac disease. I know it's only been a short time, but based on what you know from your wife, can you think of any obstacles that our community might face as we start looking to get approval and coverage and access to these drugs?
Oh yeah. So well, and I think we've highlighted a number. I think just very candidly, I think up to the point of diagnosis, I don't think I realized how severe celiac could be. Like my wife was very, very sick at one point, to the point where I was like we need we need to go like talk to someone. Um, and I think that lack of understanding is probably I would imagine pervasive among payers as well, because you're not really hitting their claims outside of diagnosis. It's self-managed. You're doing these things at home, and so there's not only a lack of understanding of kind of the lived experience that I frankly had before she was diagnosed, but it's also any new care is a new cost, and so it's a new cost to them, which creates such a additional barrier. And I do think my experience has been the same. I think payers are trying to make the right decision. It's are you hitting the right notes to help them along the way? But I think that lack of understanding and that lack of kind of already kind of care hitting their books are going to be two challenges.
I
Absolutely.
also think if you can show them that the care that they're already paying for, they may not have to pay for once they pay for the drug, right? And
Yes.
so
Yep.
it's kind of this chicken and the egg thing is and it really is. I remember sitting in a room where I'd brought some payers with me to a advisory board, and one of the payers just said, all right, stop. Help us help you. We don't know everything about all of these diseases. Help us help you. Explain to us. We get that if you have joint disease, now you're going to be more expensive. If you have this, you may have to have potential surgeries. Help us understand how we can prevent that from happening. That's what we want to know.
I,
So,
sorry. Go. What I was going to
okay.
say is, I think the challenge for the celiac population and having, I think I'd probably take care of at least 50 patients with celiac disease is I don't think the cost is as obvious as my colleagues and myself's patients groups. And I think that's the part that kind of building that argument. And I think the unfortunate thing, the biggest challenge even for my own patients with celiac disease is you need to follow with me. This is not like we diagnosed you, go on a gluten-free diet, we're never going to see you again, which is what the number of patients I've started following because they're coming for their screening colonoscopy and they're like, oh, I have celiac disease. I was like, have you seen anyone? And they're like, not in 20 years. I was
Yeah.
like, let's fix this, right? And so this is the challenge of not only with providers, insurers, but the patient population themselves. And so I think those are kind of the piece of the puzzle that the struggle is to put it together to build a coalition to prove what the costs are, what the downstream consequences are, and that's facing this patient population.
And Dr. Singh, that's such a good point. And the 20-year gap in seeing a provider, I think is going to be a really big obstacle for our community because a lot of those patients that were diagnosed 20 years ago, they don't have a copy of their biopsy. They don't have a copy of their blood test. And so, are they actually diagnosed with celiac disease? And how do you make that determination now as their, current GI to prescribe them a drug? So I think that's a really big barrier that we're going to face. So looking back, what do you wish your advocacy organization or clinicians and researchers in your fields had started doing earlier to prepare for payer discussions?
Well, I'll start on our side because we're doing it now from a lessons learned around the devices is asking payers the types of data they want to see when we come to them with an ask. And so we're doing a lot more cost modeling. Even with type 1, which is a pretty, it shows up in medical claims, there's a lot of activity that happens that's not captured in the system. And so we've started now particularly with our like Medicaid wants to see a Medicaid population, Medicare wants to see a Medicare population, commercial payers want to see something that looks like their community. So we've started on the data process much earlier to help us kind of tell that story to payers. And then the other piece is, I think there's a question about this, is getting our clinical champions lined up early to connect with their peers. And because some of the folks in these plans are, you know, clinicians and specialty in the same specialty and getting those peer conversations connected sooner rather than later, we think will be impactful as well.
I think the other thing, I think there's a couple things. One is definitely, I agree, engage earlier. I mean, just engage earlier. There's a lot of disease groups or rare disease groups that either don't have kind of written standards of care or guidelines, or they haven't changed them in 20 years. That is really important too for them to understand. And the other thing I would say is if a lot of times when there's not a drug, I don't think that there's as much communication between the payer and the clinician. And so the whole point is it starts to feel foreign to do that. It's not like the first thought is to call them.
Yeah.
The same as working with patient advocacy organizations. And the other thing is for the patient advocacy organization should really be engaging sooner. And before there's a problem, right? What you'll want to do is you want to be able to show them that, hey, we are a trusted resource you can come to. We can help be the convener. We can help bring together the people. We can help kind of, create that. And I will say that this is something that I'm going to go back to AMCP because I worked with them on this project. They have a project called the Patient Voice. And I think it's really important if you kind of go and look at the AMCP site and look for the engagement framework that was created for how patient advocacy organizations and payers can engage and what they should expect from each other, what are realistic expectations. There's a paper that's been written on it as well. And I keep saying that there are on the group that I had started at the National Hemophilia Foundation that is still in existence now. There are payers that have been sitting on that committee since 2014. They have gone out and encouraged other members that they know, others of their colleagues or peers to join. So I think it really is kind of identifying this potential, um, proponents that you can use from the payer space to talk to their colleagues as well.
Absolutely.
And I agree with that, what everyone else said. I think really identifying early on who's the patient population at target and risk stratifying that, because it might be that whatever treatment you have isn't appropriate for everyone, just like it is for inflammatory bowel disease. Then, what's the appropriate treatment outcome and having a consensus on that and what is considered appropriate monitoring. And I think if you have those up front and consensus from a professional part in a clinical guideline, that gives the support that, hey, here's why we're designing our trial like this. Here's why we have the intervention. Here's why we think your practice guideline internally for your insurance plan should kind of reflect what our knowledge base is.
Absolutely. Well, we're right at time. So thank you so much to all three of our speakers for being here today and sharing your wisdom. We're so grateful for all the stories and for the experiences that you've shared. So across today, there have been lots of themes that have emerged all across the discussion. First, approval does not guarantee access. Second, the evidence required for regulators and the evidence required by payers are often different. And third, early alignment among clinicians, researchers, patient advocates, and payers is essential. And finally, many of the tools needed for access, registries, outcome data, economic analysis, and consensus definitions have to be built before therapies reach the market. Those lessons bring us into our final session, where we'll discuss the federal research priorities and the infrastructure needed to generate the evidence that will ultimately support both innovation and patient access. So now please take just a couple of minutes break and then rejoin us for our closing session at 5:15 Eastern. Thank you, everyone.